who's sitting here?
Oh, no, you can sit there. Sit back here.
Yeah, well, so you came from the city of Richmond,
Correct, yep.
and what was your role there?
Public utilities, so a lot of combined sewer,
Yeah, he said on a couple of rapids. We were all.
yeah, water supply.
Well, most of what we do is water. I mean, it's the bulk of the agency.
Yeah.
Oh, so for the presentation, I'm just going to go in real quick.
I'm gonna go say hi to
for
these
the director's
guys.
report.
Yeah.
Say these are the organizational changes, and then I'm going to say, and then I'm going to ask Melanie to come up here and give a brief overview for new duties and responsibilities. That way. Or you can go
Well,
first.
I can introduce you.
However you want. I just thought it would be easier that way.
I don't care. It doesn't matter. Whatever.
So they can ask questions. I do like the fact that these rooms.
What brings you here?
I know, I'm just watching.
Oh, Bill of Flowers. Don't give me that crap. Sorry. I shouldn't say these things. I should.
No, you're not wrong. I'm going to have to pay for it, make it up later, so. So you're not wrong, but I know where my stars want to come say hi.
Are you getting settled in?
I'm getting settled in. Yeah.
Enjoying it?
Yeah, it's a whole different thing. But it's interesting. It's busy.
My sense is that the dynamic is a bit different because when I was there, we had two senior partners in the section that hated each other,
Oh, really?
and one of them was John Daniel, who used to lose his temper all the time.
Good morning. I'd like to call to order the November 23rd, or 29th, I'm sorry. I'm still at Thanksgiving. I'd like to call to order the November 29th, 2022 meeting of the Virginia State Water Control Board. I have a few house rules before we begin. Attendees may not erect any signage inside or outside the meeting room or the building. Attendees are not entitled to be disorderly or disrupt the meeting from proceeding in an orderly, efficient, and effective fashion. Disruptive behavior may result in a recess or removal from the building. Possession or use of any device that may disrupt the conduct of business is prohibited, including but not limited to voice amplification equipment, bullhorns, blowhorns, sirens, or other noise-producing devices, as well as signs on sticks, poles, or stakes, or helium-filled balloons. All attendees are asked to be respectful of all speakers. Rules will be enforced fairly and impartially, not only to ensure the efficient and effective conduct of business, but also to ensure no interference with the business of the complex, its employees, or guests. Attendees wishing to record the proceedings are welcome to do so. However, you may not interfere with the business of the meeting nor impede the view or participation of other meeting attendees and staff. No smoking is allowed unless in a designated outside space. This includes tobacco and e-cigarettes. No alcohol, fireworks, pyrotechnics, weapons, or any substances or items controlled by law are allowed. No firearms are allowed in the state's contracted spaces except for firearms carried by law enforcement officers or authorized security personnel. All violators may be subject to removal from the meeting facility. Anyone removed from the facility may not re-enter. Anyone who fails to comply with removal may be charged with trespass. And with that, I'll begin with introductions of the members beginning on my left.
Scott Cameron, Fairfax County.
Robert Dunn, Chester, Virginia.
Jill Cohen, Falls Church, Virginia.
Heather Wood, Norfolk, Virginia.
Lou Wallace, Southwest Virginia.
Ryan Seeger, Springfield, Virginia.
Jerry Kilgore, Henrico, Virginia.
Mike Rollman, Director of DEQ.
Eric Lansing, Office of the Attorney General.
Thank you. And with that, we'll begin with agenda item number 1, tab A of your board book, the minutes from the August 25th, 2022 meeting.
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Dunn.
Madam Chairman, I move we approve the minutes of the August 25th, 2022 meeting.
A second?
There's been a motion and a second. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. So we will begin now with the business of the board. Second item on the agenda, final regulations. Reissuance of Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, general permit for non-contact cooling water discharges of 50,000 gallons per day or less, 9 VAC 25-196, tab B of your book, board book. And Mr. Bryan.
All right. Good morning, Chair, members of the board. Again, this is the reissuance of the General VIPD's permit regulation for non-contact cooling water discharges of 50,000 gallons per day or less, 9 VAC 25-196, and we are bringing it final before the board this morning. Next slide. Do I have it up here? Oh, I have a clicker. Oh, we got it, I think. Okay, there we go. All right. So again, non-contact cooling water general permit. The proposed regulation was approved by the board for notice of public comment and hearing on the June 22nd, 2022 board meeting. We had a public comment period from July 18th through September 16th of 2022. The public hearing was held during the comment period on August 17th. We do not have any public attendees to that hearing, and so we received no comments during the hearing. We did not receive any public comments during the public comment period. We did receive one comment from EPA Region 3. Oh, there we go. We did have a few changes since the proposed stage. First, we updated the date of the Code of Federal Regulations that's incorporated by reference in 9 VAC 25-196-15. It was July 1st, 2021. Now it's July 1st, 2022. It's just the most recent publication. We also updated the language in the authorization to discharge section, specifically B4, and it clarifies that discharge is not eligible for coverage under this general permit if it is not consistent with the assumptions and requirements of a TMDL approved prior to the term of this general permit. So that was a language change to make it the same as our other general permits. Third, we did remove one of our new registration statement requirements that was added for the proposed stage. This one was specific to cooling water intake structures at hydropower facilities. And the reasoning for that was that EPA released a revised framework document in July of 2022. We based our original edition on the 2021 version. They released a revised one in July 2022, which removed the water use efficiency calculation as an option for BPJ 316B determinations, specific, again, to hydropower facilities. The requirement was then removed for the final regulation, which is presented to you today. And as a note, hydropower facilities are still required to submit cooling water intake structure data under sections 13A and 13B of the new requirements. The comment that we received from EPA Region 3, you might see this more than once today, was on our Part 2 section specifically, and I've got the whole comment up here. The draft permit allows for automatic transfer of coverage to a new permittee if the current permittee notifies the department within 30 days of the transfer of the title to the facility or property, and that's how it is currently listed in the regulation. They continue, this permit condition appears to be consistent with 40 CFR 122-61B1, which requires the permittee to notify the director at least 30 days in advance of the proposed transfer date. So ours says within, theirs says, or the federal regulation says in advance. EPA recommended that we revisit the automatic transfer of coverage condition in the permit to ensure consistency with the regulations. And so our response was that we reviewed the differences between the federal reg and the VIPD's reg and the draft language in the current permit or in the proposed permit. and DEQ intends to retain the language as drafted in order to ease the burden of administering the general permit on staff. And are there any questions on that?
Any questions for Mr. Bryan? You may proceed with recommendation.
Thank you. Staff recommendation, we recommend that the board adopts the amendments to the general VIP's permit for non-contact cooling water discharges of 50,000 gallons per day, 9 VSC 25-196, as amended and presented to you today. And secondly, staff also recommends the board affirm that it will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision of this regulation as provided by the Administrative Process Act.
Are there any questions regarding staff recommendation or any comments? There being none, I'll entertain a motion.
Madam Chair, move to accept staff recommendations, please.
I'll second that.
Motion's been made by Ms. Wallace and seconded by Mr. Cameron. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda, under final regulations, reissuance of Virginia Pollution Discharge Elimination System general permit for potable water treatment plants. Ms. Daub.
Thank you. We intend to reissue the general permit for potable water treatment plants, 9 VAC 25860.
Eleanor, if I can interrupt you for a minute, if you could just pull the mic a little bit closer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Expires June 30th, 2023. Next slide. We have currently 109 facilities covered. Primarily, they are localities treating and distributing drinking water to their constituents. We had a notice of intended regulatory action published in August 2021. Technical Advisory Committee was held with the VDH, Office of Drinking Water, Augusta County was involved, Virginia American Water Works Association, Virginia Municipal Drinking Water Association. We had a TAC meeting on January 6th of this year. The board approved public comment in March 2022. A notice of public comment was published April for 60 days. EPA, same comments we received on the transfer of permit special condition, the 30-day requirement that you just heard about. We had a public hearing on June 2nd. No attendees came to the public hearing. The significant changes that were proposed in Section 10, we added a definition of conventional filtration treatment from the VDH Waterworks regulation, copied same definition. We amended the definition for membrane treatment. In Sections 40 and 70, we updated the effective dates. Section 60C, registration questions, we added the monthly average processed wastewater flow and Virginia Department of Public Health water supply identification number. We also revised the schematic drawing instructions to show the treatment of the water from broad water intake through finished water distribution to clearly indicate where the pollutants could enter the processed discharge water. In Section 60E, we added that the electronic reporting date is established for this industry. Registration statement shall be submitted electronically, and we will give them 3 months' notice. Next. In Section 70, Parts 1A and 2, we clarified the footnote, the instructions for composite sampling to match similar other permits. Section 70, Part 1A and 2, we added the limits for TSS and chlorine for the reverse osmosis plant discharge limits, because we determined that certain conventional treatment technologies could be used prior to reverse osmosis, so we needed those limits included. And in Section 70, Part 1B8, we added the instructions on how to calculate monthly average and maximum and daily maximum for quarterly reporting. In Section 70, Part 2C, in the conditions applicable to all permits, it's just electronic reporting date is established. We're going to give them 3 months notice. And Section 70, Part 2I, updated DEQ's pollution response reporting link. Next.
Are there any questions for Eleanor? You may proceed with staff recommendations.
The staff recommends that the board adopt the amendments to the Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System General Permit Regulation for potable water treatment plants, 9 VSC 25-860, as amended and presented to you today. The staff also recommends that the board affirm that it will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision of this regulation as provided by the Administrative Process Act.
Any questions regarding staff recommendation? There being none, I move that we accept staff recommendation.
I'll second that.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We get to see you again, so you get to stay there, right? You get to stand up. Next item on the agenda, proposed regulations, reissuance of Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System General Permit for Concrete Products Facilities, 9 VAC 25-193. It's tab D of your board book.
We currently have 225 facilities covered. You could put up the next slide. Maybe not. Under this permit. They're primarily facilities that are producing ready-mix concrete. We published a notice of intended regulatory action on October 11th, 2021. We received one comment regarding construction site washout concerns about the improper management and discharge. And we also got other comments for requests to participate on the TAC. And we did offer all those technical advisory committee people that asked to be on the TAC. They were invited. In Section 10, we added a definition for corrective action that was taken directly from the Industrial Stormwater General Permit Regulation for consistency. In Sections 40 and 70, we updated the effective dates to reflect the new effective dates for the permit. Section 60E, we added, again, the e-reporting responsibilities that once it's established for the industry, then the registration statements have to be submitted electronically. In Section 70, Part 1B4, we amended the dust suppression allowances to revise that to reflect similar requirements that are in the construction stormwater general permit to allow for discharge of dust suppression water provided that it has been treated. And in Part 71B16, a TNBL requirement was expanded so that if the TMDL establishes a numerical waste load allocation for that facility, the owner shall monitor and implement measures to meet that allocation. Also, at permit reissuance, the permittee shall submit a demonstration that the waste load allocation is being met. Next. Also, significant changes that were proposed in Part 2, the stormwater management requirements have been updated, and they've also been reordered to match the order and the requirements that are in the industrial stormwater general permit. We're just trying to maintain consistencies with the industrial stormwater requirements in all these permits. The monitoring requirements, the visuals, and the benchmark requirements have been moved. Corrective actions, control measures, considerations, and eliminating and minimizing exposure requirements have been added. Routine facility inspections have been moved out of the stormwater controls and into its own subdivision. And other changes are being proposed because of the Technical Advisory Committee stakeholder suggestions. It includes deletion of the requirement to report duration of the rainfall events on the DMR, and signature and stormwater pollution prevention program review and maintaining and updating the stormwater pollution prevention plan subsections have been moved around. And in Part 3C, and the conditions applicable to all permits under the reporting, that once electronic reporting dates have been established, that the industry shall submit their reporting electronically if we give them 3 months' notice.
Any questions for Eleanor?
Madam Chair, one quick question.
Ryan?
Ms. Dowd, with respect to the public comment on the construction site washout concerns, can you go into more detail what the concerns were and whether any changes were made in the proposed rule to address those concerns? The comment on you mentioned there was one comment received regarding construction site washout concerns about improper management and discharge. Can you go into more detail what that concern might have been, and were any changes made to the proposal to address that concern? Or did you not think it was warranted?
Not in this, no.
So can you go into more detail what the concerns might have been?
Well, their concern was on the construction sites, which is not covered in this permit. Okay.
Madam Chairman, may I?
Yes, Ms. Davenport.
So I think we talked at a meeting before, one or two before now, about how we are also engaged in the Technical Advisory Committee to reissue the construction general permit. And there is a requirement in that permit about managing concrete washout basins so that if you're on a construction site and you're rinsing out your truck, you don't just discharge it. Under the federal general permit, there's recommendations like using a kiddie pool or building a plastic-lined basin with hay bales. We actually have a couple folks who are participating in the TAC for the reissuance of that permit who have a business that actually manufactures a better system for managing concrete washout, and they're actively working in the context of that permit for us to require something a bit more tailored than just a kiddie pool or a plastic-lined washout basin. So they just incorporated, they forwarded those comments in the context of this general permit too. So it's an issue that we're discussing in the context of the construction general permit, which is where it's appropriately addressed. And we'll see how that turns out.
Any other questions for Eleanor?
Madam Chair, just add, Terry, Ryan, if you look on page 6, the comment is there in the response. And I happen to used to work right near where he's complaining about, and his comments are correct. Sure.
Any further questions or comments? You may proceed with staff recommendation.
Staff recommends the board authorize the public comment period and public hearing for amendments to VPDES general permit regulation for concrete products facilities, 9 VAC 25-193, and authorize the staff to serve as the hearing officer at the public hearing.
Any questions or comments regarding staff recommendation?
Madam Chairman, I move we accept the staff recommendation.
Second.
Motion's been made by Mr. Cameron and seconded by Mr. Dunn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Eleanor. Next item on the agenda, under proposed regulations, reissuance of general VPDES permit for discharges of stormwater from small municipal separate storm sewer systems, 9 VAC 25-890. Mr. Nguyen.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Derek Nguyen, and I will be presenting proposed amendments for the small MS4 regulation and general permit under 9 VAC 25-890 for the board's consideration this morning. Next slide. So just in case some of you all are not familiar with MS4s, I just thought I'd break down what an MS4 is in the context of this regulation. First off, small means not a large MS4, which I mean it seems obvious, but those are our largest urban localities that are covered under a Phase 1 individual permit. Municipal means government operated. Separate means not part of a combined sanitary sewer system. And storm sewer system means a system of conveyances that discharges storm water to receiving water bodies. And pollution sources are from urban stormwater runoff from developed lands. And regulated small MS4s must be located in the 2010 census urbanized area based on criteria established by EPA Phase 2 MS4 rulemaking for automatic designation of regulated small MS4s. Next slide. So the objective of the MS4 general permit is to minimize pollution entering the MS4 and prevent pollution discharges to receiving waters from the MS4 to the maximum extent practicable, or MEP. MEP is the standard for MS4 programs rather than traditional VIPDs technology or water quality based limitations. Permit conditions are programmatic in nature, and both MS4 permits and MS4 programs are implemented through an iterative approach. Changes in strategy for MS4 program implementation are expected in order to improve MS4 program effectiveness over time. And the small MS4 general permit establishes MEP through the implementation of an MS4 program, which includes 6 minimum control measures and TMDL special conditions. Next slide. So just very briefly, I'll just run through the 6 minimum control measures. They are public education and outreach, public participation, illicit discharge detection and elimination, construction stormwater management, post-construction stormwater management, pollution prevention and good housekeeping, and the Chesapeake Bay TMDL special condition, and lastly, the local TMDL special condition. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of the type of systems that are covered under the MS4 general permit, we have 44 localities, 23 colleges and universities, 14 military bases, and a handful of other state, federal, and local school MS4 systems that are covered under this general permit. Next slide. So this map shows in gray the 2010 census urbanized area, just to give you an idea of the geographic distribution of small MS4s throughout the state. In northern, central, and tidewater area, small MS4s share watersheds with a lot of the large MS4s, and we also have some small MS4s in the Shenandoah Valley, Blue Ridge, and just a handful in Southwest Virginia. Next slide. So for a quick background on this regulatory action, in September 2021, the NORA was posted on Virginia Town Hall announcing DEQ's intent to reissue the small MS4 general permit and amend the small MS4 regulation. A technical advisory committee, or TAC, was formed and amendments were drafted taking into consideration recommendations from the TAC received during 8 TAC meetings held from December 2021 to September 2022. For TAC representation, there were a total of 15 TAC members, and they represented various entities. We had 3 localities, 3 planning organizations, 2 environmental nonprofits, 2 state colleges and universities, 2 environmental consultants, and 1 local public school system, 1 federal military branch, and 1 state transportation agency. As far as the geographic distribution of the TAC membership, there were 7 TAC members that represented statewide organizations, 3 from Tidewater, Virginia, 2 from Northern, 2 from Blue Ridge, and 1 from the Valley. So next, I just wanted to bring to y'all's attention how the census plays into this regulation. For a small MS4 designation. In the past, each new decennial census would bring program expansion with both existing permittees gaining regulated MS4 service area and also pulling in new government entities that previously were not an urbanized area. So due to the discontinuation of the Census Bureau's classification of urbanized area for the 2020 census, the general permit does not include provisions for designation of new MS4s outside of the 2010 census urbanized area. So EPA's Phase 2 small MS4 rulemaking refers to the term urbanized area and not urban area. It's a very slight change, but it is a, you know, in wording, but they do mean very different things in the criteria that was established for the new urban area. You know, the new urban area criteria significantly deviates from previous census urbanized area criteria by effectively combining both what was previously urbanized area and less populous urban clusters, which was a previous classification that essentially both urbanized area and urban clusters are being combined to create urban area. And next slide. So I'm just pulling up this map again. So in this map, the areas in green are urban clusters. So essentially, you know, if we were to use urban area for automatic designation, you'd be potentially pulling in, you know, under regulation under the MS4 general permit, a lot of small towns and surrounding counties such as Tappahannock, Colonial Beach, Front Royal, Tazewell, Wytheville, and you know, this change in scope is inconsistent with the Phase 2 small MS4 rulemaking established by EPA and also with their interim guidance that they recently published this year that addresses the new urban area criteria versus the old urbanized area. And we are going to be awaiting further direction from EPA on how we are going to address that issue moving forward. But it's a change we're not making in this proposed regulation today. Next slide. So the remainder of my presentation is going to be on the significant changes to this regulation. First, we added a handful of definitions, first being annual practices. This definition was added because there has been a lot of confusion regarding pollution reduction calculations for TMDL action plans for practices such as street cleaning. And this definition helps clarify reductions from these practices are only good for 1 year, or some people refer to it as kind of a term credit. So you have to keep doing the practice on an annual basis. You can't just continue to claim credit for something done in a previous year. Next, we added a definition for ecosystem restoration projects. This definition was added recognizing these projects do not fit the definition of a stormwater management facility as defined in 9 VAC 25-870. And these projects need to be inspected and maintained in order to maintain TMDL action plan pollution reductions. Example of a ecosystem restoration project would be stream restoration, shoreline restoration, and even reforestation. Next, for high priority facilities, this was a definition that was in the 2018 regulation, and we modified this definition to add a qualifier that high priority facilities, in order to be classified as that, you need to discharge. The facility needs to discharge to an MS4. If it's not discharging to an MS4, we probably shouldn't be qualified as a high priority facility. And we also clarified some of the activities that meet that definition. So, next, we have 2 more definitions were added for both traditional and non-traditional permittees. Traditional permittees are essentially your standard counties, cities, and towns, operated under a county board of supervisors, city council, or town council. So these are your traditionals, and non-traditionals was actually easier to define by what it's not, because it's a handful of various different state and federal agencies, and even some cases, some regional authorities and local school boards, which don't meet that definition of traditional because they have a separate board. Next slide. So, speaking of traditional and non-traditional permit conditions, this proposed permit introduces provisions that are specifically tailored to either traditional or non-traditional permittees, recognizing differences in authority and program needs between these different types of permittees. So some examples of some traditional or non-traditional specific provisions include public education and outreach, public participation, target audience identification, erosion and sediment control, program implementation, and VSMP administration, as well as a few of the local TMDL special conditions. So there were a handful of changes made to reporting requirements. First being requiring electronic submission of annual reports after at least 3 months' notice provided to DEQ pursuant to the EPA e-reporting rule. We're also requiring permittees to provide MS4 maps in a GIS shapefile format and no longer allowing PDF format to satisfy this requirement, and also establishing data standards for GIS shapefile submission. And data standards are for quality assurance and to promote consistent formatting for DEQ MS4 geodatabase efforts. Next, we are removing the electronic stormwater management facility database requirements, as these requirements are duplicative of the BMP warehouse reporting requirements, and I think it was the intent of the previous permit writer to phase that out over time with the installation of the BMP warehouse. And lastly, we are clarifying BMP warehouse reporting requirements for ecosystem restoration assets. The draft general permit has a new section, Part 3, dedicated to the BMP warehouse, since both the Minimum Control Measure 5 stormwater management facilities and TMDL Action Plan ecosystem restoration projects need to be reported to the warehouse, and I think that was just a ambiguity that needed to be clarified in the permit. Next slide. So for under illicit discharge detection and elimination, dry weather screening, we included an optional risk-based approach. These provisions allow permittees to identify observation points based on illicit discharge risks upstream of an outfall versus just strictly screening the outfalls and strictly adhering to just the outfall. It's kind of giving them the option to take a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach, just to provide additional flexibility and effectiveness for illicit discharge programs. These provisions are voluntary, and permittees may adopt this approach at their discretion. For some, it might not make sense. For example, like a community college with a pretty small system, establishing observation points on a small campus probably wouldn't work, but it could be something a larger system, a larger operator might be interested in, such as a county. Next slide. So under pollution prevention and good housekeeping, we had some significant reorganization to clarify permit conditions. First, we differentiated between the objectives good housekeeping procedures shall meet and activities that require procedures. We integrated existing good housekeeping permit conditions into written procedures. There were a lot of just conditions that were somewhat disjointed from an applicable procedure, so we integrated those conditions into the procedural requirements. Also, we improved written procedure linkage with associated contract language and training requirements. Simply just moved these sections up to directly follow the procedure requirements. And lastly, we removed SWIP applicability subjectivity and integrated utilization of applicable good housekeeping procedures. And the subjectivity that was incorporated into the previous permit was there was a lot of use of the term with a high potential to discharge, and that got interpreted by DEQ staff and permittees very differently. So we just wanted to eliminate that discrepancy, essentially so they can just follow the checklist of the 9 determining factors that determine whether or not a facility needs a SWIP. Next slide. So to summarize the procedural changes for good housekeeping, essentially we have 4 good housekeeping procedure objectives, which are prevent illicit discharges, properly dispose of waste materials, prevent discharge of wastewater or wash water, and minimize pollutants and stormwater runoff. Next slide. So this slide shows the 6 activities that would require good housekeeping procedures, and they are paved surface maintenance and cleaning, renovation and significant exterior building maintenance, discharge of pumped water from construction and maintenance activities, temporary storage of landscaping materials. Permanent storage is actually covered under the SWIP requirements, and that would be something that would likely need a SWIP. Vehicle and equipment maintenance, and pesticide, herbicide, and fertilizer application. So, can you back up one slide? I just wanted to add that these 6 activities are currently in the permit with the exception of renovation and significant exterior building maintenance. This was added because in my experience I've seen EPA contractors hone in on renovation type activities. So I really just wanted to have something in place for our permittees to prevent compliance action from EPA and DEQ in the future. Next slide. So next, also under minimum control measure 6, for nutrient management plans, we're requiring DCR approval and renewal of nutrient management plans. DCR has actually raised concerns over the number of expired MS4 nutrient management plans, and this was somewhat of a result of the 2018 permit being ambiguous regarding which agency is the nutrient management plan approval authority and did not specifically require nutrient management plan renewal. DCR their nutrient management planning staff has reviewed the proposed nutrient management plan provision and has agreed with the changes. So we kept them involved in the process. Next slide. So for local TMDLs, we are requiring chloride TMDL action plans. This was not in the 2018 permit. So Virginia got our first chloride TMDL, the Actink Creek chloride TMDL, and it is currently the only chloride TMDL in Virginia. So it really only be applicable to MS4s in the Actink Creek watershed. Permittees may utilize the Virginia Salt Management Strategies Toolkit, or SAMS, for salt management BMP implementation for their action plans. And traditional permittees must include a public education and outreach component for commercial and residential salt application. And we added this chloride action plan requirement simply because over-application of salt is somewhat common in commercial parking lots, and some public education and outreach could potentially help in terms of just giving the public some knowledge on how to reduce salt application while maintaining public safety. Next slide. So for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL special condition, we are requiring third phase Chesapeake Bay TMDL action plan submittal 12 months after the permit is reissued. Completion of 100% of the Bay TMDL pollution reductions are required by the end of the permit term. The Chesapeake Bay TMDL implementation annual status reports are to be maintained as a separate document from the annual report and posted to the publicly accessible stormwater webpage. This change was made just because there has been a lot of difficulty trying to parse out the updates for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL on an annual basis just from the annual report. And, permittees tend to put it in different places, and it's kind of all over the map. So we just wanted some level of consistency. So interested parties would be able to find updates on Bay TMDL implementation. And lastly, we are requiring inspection and maintenance procedures for ecosystem restoration projects utilized for TMDL action plans as well. Kind of calling back to some of the other changes that I'd mentioned earlier. Next slide. So we are bringing before you one change that was not discussed by the TAC. That is the removal of sediment reduction requirements under the Chesapeake Bay TMDL special condition. This change arose late in the reg development process, and sediment reductions will still be provided by putting measures in place to meet nitrogen and phosphorus reductions. However, sediment will no longer be the driver in determining what BMPs permittees put in place. So this kind of goes back to 2019 when the Chesapeake Bay Program Principal Staff Committee approved Phase 3 WIP language for developing sediment targets. Sediment loads are managed in the Bay TMDL to specifically address the water clarity and submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV. Research in the Bay has shown that water clarity and SAV is generally more responsive to nutrient load reductions than it is to reduction in sediment loads. And this is because the algae that is fueled by the nutrients can block as much, if not more, light from reaching SAV as opposed to sediment. Next slide. And I do have just one correction for this slide. The first bullet there should say on November 22nd, not DEQ will be. So that letter has been sent to EPA Region 3 explaining the change in sediment specifically. And DEQ has revised the MS4 GP language to remove the previously required sediment load reductions. The GP will continue to include the required nutrient load reductions, which are expected to also achieve additional sediment reductions. And these revisions were also sent to the TAC on November 22nd. If authorized, DEQ will hold a public comment period that specifically solicits comment on the proposed removal of the sediment reduction requirements under the Chesapeake Bay TMDL special condition. Next slide. So in summary, there are really 6 objectives for the proposed amendments presented today. First being clarification. We clarified permit conditions to provide permittees with clear expectations to prevent compliance uncertainty. Example of this would be tailoring specific provisions for traditional and non-traditional permittees, and also the reformatting that took place in Minimum Control Measure 6. And second is flexibility. We incorporated additional flexibility into permit conditions to promote MS4 program effectiveness. An example of this would be the dry weather screening risk-based approach. And third, we eliminated redundancy. An example of this would be the elimination of the stormwater management facility database and emphasizing BMP warehouse reporting. Next is modernization. We updated reporting requirements to utilize web-based tools for e-reporting, BMP reporting, mapping, and training. Fifth is transparency. We improve reporting in a manner to be accessible to interested parties and demonstrate progress towards achieving Chesapeake Bay TMDL targets. And lastly, utilization of latest available science. And an example of this is the removal of the sediment reduction requirements from the Chesapeake Bay TMDL special condition. Next slide. So before I proceed to staff recommendations, may I answer any questions the board may have? Yes.
You eliminated the total suspended solids, and I'm assuming that is because you said here the nutrient loading reductions will take care of that? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, so one of the issues we've run into is we've got a lot of permittees that are chasing sediment, but the findings of the Chesapeake Bay Program Principal Staff Committee said that there's actually more of an impact on SAV and water clarity from the nutrient loading and not the sediment loading. And so we didn't want sediment to be the driver when it's not the effective solution at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chairman, I've got a question.
Mr. Cameron.
Thank you. To what extent are military bases, which I know are covered under this proposed general permit, are they in compliance with the requirements that are currently on the books in terms of stormwater management, or are military bases or federal facilities more generally a problem?
It probably depends on the base that you're referring to. We did have the U.S. Navy participated on the TAC meeting, and I think that they run a pretty tight ship. Pardon the pun, but
I would hope so.
But there are some that lag behind. So I would say it's a mixed bag. Some of them are really sharp and implement great programs. Others are somewhat lagging as far as program implementation.
Does DEQ have the authority to enforce on federal facilities?
Yeah. So as this program is established under the Clean Water Act, and EPA has delegated the authority for us to run the FIFTI's program, which establishes our authority.
Okay. And one last question, if I might, Madam Chairman. Do I understand correctly that some of these ecosystem-related activities, such as reforestation, are effective at nutrient management in addition to reducing the volume of water that has to be dealt with?
Certainly. For reforestation, you're going to have additional uptake from from the trees, and also for another example, like a stream restoration project, a big part of that is reconnection to the floodplain. A lot of these incised channels, have no connectivity to the floodplain, and once you restore the stream and reconnect that stream to the floodplain, you get additional infiltration, in the floodplain as well. So there is some volume reduction that can be associated with this. Shoreline restoration, probably not so much, because that's more of you're preventing sediment loss due to tidal forces.
Any other questions for Mr. Nguyen?
Madam Chair,
Ryan, Mr. Seeger.
One quick question with respect to going back to the sediment issue, the suspended solids. I hear you in terms of the belief is that that's where the science is going in terms of that nutrients are more critical to restoration than sediment. Is that a consensus opinion amongst the Chesapeake Bay states, or is that a position of the state of Virginia? I heard you say in terms of the Chesapeake Bay office that there was kind of a discussion on that. I'm just kind of curious, are we leading on this, or is this something that everybody's collectively doing as a kind of a unit that the focus should be more on nutrients than on sediment?
I think this was something that was established by the Chesapeake Bay program.
Chesapeake Bay program, I mean EPA's Chesapeake Bay program?
I'm sorry, can you?
EPA's Chesapeake Bay program?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Any further questions or comments? You may proceed with staff recommendation.
All right, so staff recommends that the board authorize a public comment period and public hearing for amendments to the VIPD's general permit for small municipal separate storm sewer systems, 9 VAC 25-890, and also authorize town hall posting to directly solicit comments on removal of sediment reduction requirements from the Chesapeake Bay TMDL special condition. And lastly, authorize staff to serve as hearing officers at the public hearing.
Any questions or comments regarding staff recommendation?
Madam Chairman, I move that we accept the staff recommendation.
Second.
Motion's been made by Mr. Cameron and seconded by Mr. Dunn. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, motion carries.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda under proposed regulations, 9 VAC 25-210, Virginia Water Protection Permit Regulation, 9 VAC 25-610, Groundwater Withdrawal Regulations, amendments establishing criteria for water auditing plans and leak detection and repair plans, and requiring applications to include plans, as required by Chapter 100 of the 2021 Special Session 1 Acts of Assembly. Mr. Cudlis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning.
That's like a long title there.
Huh?
Just teasing. Go ahead.
And members of the State Water Control Board, as indicated, my name is Scott Cudlis, and I manage the Office of Water Supply. And I'll be providing the presentation today for the agenda item that's included as tab F in your board book. As indicated by the chair, these are two separate but related regulatory actions. Before I get started, I wanted to draw your attention to an errata sheet that I believe was just distributed to you related to two minor changes in the regulatory text that were missed. On page 10, as you can see, midway through the page there was a "and" after the semicolon, after the word "included," that was supposed to be stricken and indicated as such, and that was omitted by accident, so that should be added to your version. And then the final change is on the last page, where there was a typo in the reference to the statewide building code regulation, and that should be, as it is indicated earlier, 13 VAC 5-63. So those are the two changes that are included in that errata sheet that was just passed out to you. And that is the version that you will be taking action on. So let's, next slide, please. Let's begin with a little bit of background. A number of you are probably aware of several of the different water resource related challenges that DEQ and the Commonwealth has dealt with over the last decade. Some of them include economic development, population growth, climate change. Those are common drivers of some of the water resource challenges that we have. But that's not an exclusive list. Others include aging infrastructure and things like that. Over the course of the last decade, DEQ has issued a number of different reports, plans, and have taken action to address a number of these challenges. Some of those are listed here. And one of the opportunities that was consistently identified over that range of different things that are listed here is that many of our localities and some of our other users do have some water efficiency issues related to loss of water from their systems, from the point of withdrawal to where it's actually beneficially used. And so that's what we're trying to get at here with these changes that are before you today. Next slide. So all of that information that we just referenced in the previous slide raised awareness at the General Assembly level, and statutory change was made in 2021 that requires water audits and leak detection repair plans, in all applications submitted for either a Virginia water protection permit, which is how we authorize surface water withdrawals, or a groundwater withdrawal permit. And as I said, the focus is really trying to establish kind of a continuous process for permitted use where permittees consistently collect data to improve their efficiency and make decisions on a regular basis of where those opportunities exist and how to address them. So the NORA was published in January, on January 31st of 2021. The public comment period went from that date through March 3rd of 2022. We did receive 2 comments. One was from the Virginia Virginia Manufacturing Association, and the second one was from Mission H2O, which is a collective of water permittees that has an interest particularly in water resource management issues. There were, I would just characterize those comments as concerns about how do these requirements relate to some existing requirements in the Groundwater Act and the groundwater withdrawal permitting regulation. But there were also some concerns that I would characterize as these are some new things for some of our users, so try to provide the greatest degree of flexibility you can so that they can address their issues as they learn how best to deal with them. And I believe we've tried to address those, and you can see in detail in attachment B of your handout the response that we had to those comments. In addition, those 2 commenters recommended individuals to participate on our regulatory advisory panel, and then we did receive 2 other requests to participate on the panel. Next slide, please. So this is the list of members that the director appointed to be on our regulatory advisory panel. As you can see, they represent a broad and diverse group of water users and permittees. The director did appoint all 4 of those individuals that expressed an interest through the comment period to participate in this advisory panel. We can move on to the next slide. The RAP was formed, and as I just said, the members that were nominated were included. The RAP met 4 times over the course of the summer and concluded their work on August 23rd, 2022. And during their work, the RAP kind of formulated some of their own goals for the outcome of this process. They were looking to achieve at least some general consistency in terms of what the requirements were for both groundwater permits and surface water withdrawal permits. So they wanted some basic consistency. It didn't have to be exactly the same, and they acknowledged there were already some regulatory differences, and those should be recognized. But again, as was mentioned earlier in some of the comments that we received in the Neuer process, there was also a concern that some of these things would be new, particularly for commercial and industrial users, and that we should incorporate some flexibility into that process. And I think the RAP consistently looked at those goals in their discussion and debate about the actual language that resulted that's in front of you today. The other thing that was talked about a lot during the regulatory advisory panel was that they wanted this, to the greatest extent it could be, a data-driven decision-making process, and they wanted to, through this regulatory incentive, to encourage people to internalize that type of process. And so, said another way, they want the data that's being collected through the audit to inform the decisions that would be made regarding how to go forward with an effective leak detection and repair plan. I'm happy to report that given all of that and given the diversity of users that we had on the RAP and that we do permit through these programs, the RAP did reach consensus on the recommendation for the proposed amendments that are in front of you. Next slide. So, as I said, these are two separate but related actions. The statute did change both authorizing statutes. So, as I said, we have a different reg that relates to surface water withdrawals and then another reg that relates to groundwater withdrawals. The Virginia Water Protection Permit Program regulation is the vehicle that we use to authorize those surface water withdrawals, and it is the primary action related to this set of two regulatory actions. Because the groundwater withdrawal permitting regulation already had a structure or an entity in the permit called a groundwater conservation and management plan, there was an interest by the RAP members to use that existing structure, which focused on customized requirements by water user type, and that was carried forward into the surface water withdrawal regulation. So the general consistency across the two regulations focuses on that structure, where it's focused on the characteristics of the water use type and the facility characteristics, the unique conditions of each facility. And they felt that that provided the most significant flexibility. One of the things that you may be aware of if you have followed any of the other activities around the country that other states have adopted to address these water loss kinds of issues, there's been a lot of work done on the public water supply side. The American Waterworks Association has a free software that they provide that even some of our Virginia localities use. But what has happened with those localities in Virginia is they've tweaked the little things here and there. On the commercial and industrial side and on the ag side, they don't have as much experience and there aren't as many kind of off-the-shelf solutions. So it's more about creating that flexibility to get these entities in the process of assessing what these issues are at each facility and customizing a solution to address them. And so that's the flexibility we've provided. Next slide, please. So we did have to add a couple of new definitions that were not already in the VWP regulation. There was not a definition for water loss, and there was not a definition for water loss audit. And the Regulatory Advisory Panel did negotiate a definition, and both of those definitions are new and were added in 9 VAC 25-210-300. Next slide. All right. The other significant changes, and this is where we're getting into the meat of what the requirements are amendments to the application submission requirements. And that is located at 9 VAC 25-210-340B. So in the case of public water supplies, the new requirement was added by creating a new subsection number 14 that, one, requires the water auditing plan for an annual water loss audit. But second, it also specifies what the expectations are for that plan, what it should include generally, and what the expected reporting frequency is for submitting that data to DEQ as part of those permits. The second thing that was done related to public water supplies is that another subsection, subsection 15, was added to specifically address then the follow-up process of the leak detection and repair plan. And again, it specifies what should be included and what that reporting frequency should be. Next slide, please. So moving on, as I said, we have kind of three broad categories: public water supply, commercial and industrial, and then agriculture. So the second one is commercial and industrial. Again, we amended the same section in the regulation that applies to application requirements. We added a new subsection 16 that includes the water auditing plan and annual water loss audit requirement for commercial and industrial. And again, common language you'll notice is repeated related to that and the reporting frequency. Now, you'll see here to address one of those flexibility issues, the frequency for reporting is different. These folks have a little bit longer to report. They have a 3-year window there. Okay. There's also a new subsection 17 added that deals with the leak detection and repair plan. And again, consistent with the theme, specifies what it should include and what the reporting frequency is. Next slide. Agriculture, same section, but adding a new subsection relating to the requirement for the audit. And then subsection 19 for the leak detection and repair plan. One of the discussions in the RAP related to agriculture is that there are a number of existing types of plans that many agricultural operations already have related to matching up the type of crop with the amount of water applied through irrigation. And they wanted that work not to be obsolete. They wanted that work to be used as a component or vehicle for this requirement. And that made sense to everybody on the RAP, and that's how that flexibility is provided for agriculture. Okay, next slide, please. So again, we're moving on to the groundwater withdrawal regulation. This is the secondary action. As I said, you'll see what look to be more requirements, and while that is true, that's simply because those requirements pre-existed this change and were not affected by the statutory change and are still valid today. So what you'll see is some reorganization that took place to kind of restructure it to make a little bit more sense with the new requirements. Again, based on the premise that we're focusing on maximum flexibility and on designing the requirements based on the characteristics of the water use type and the facility characteristics. Next slide. So we had the same definitions to add on the groundwater withdrawal permitting side for water loss and water loss audit. Interestingly, there was not a public water supply definition in the groundwater withdrawal program, so we did add a definition similar to the one that's in surface water, the VWP regulation. Next slide, please. So public water supplies, again, structured the same language, except in this case, we're amending a different regulation, 9 VAC 25.610.100B. Again, this is application requirements section of that groundwater withdrawal permitting regulation. And we added a new requirement within subsection 1 for public water supplies. Next slide. Same theme. We modified a new requirement in subsection 2 for commercial and industrial applications. Same language that you saw in the surface water withdrawal regulation. Next slide. Again, same section, agriculture. We modified subsection 3 with the same language that we had, same new language that we had in the surface water section. Next slide, please. So at that point, that concludes my presentation prior to making the staff recommendation. So I'm happy to address any questions that you might have before moving to that step.
Mr. Kilgore.
Yes, thank you. Can you tell me the background on the 2021 legislation? Did that come from DEQ recommendation, or did it come from the General Assembly?
It did come from DEQ.
Okay, it did come from DEQ. And can you also then, there has to be direct cost to localities that we found we couldn't come up with a number here, but there has to be direct cost to localities to comply with this.
We just don't know what it is, and it varies so widely.
Did we think about limiting this to older systems? Has the VMA recommended, or the other organization recommended it? It seems like we needed to limit this to older systems and not every system in the Commonwealth.
Well, that's not really a fair assumption, in that we do have older systems that do have water loss, though they have, by necessity, been having to address them longer, in part because you don't want to produce water that you don't get paid for. But we do have water losses in all of our systems, and in fact, even with new systems, it's not uncommon to see 10 to 20% loss in the system.
I'm just worried about more cost to end consumers with water bills, given our new regulation.
Yeah, I mean, we did talk about those types of things in the regulatory advisory panel, and that did not appear to be a significant concern to at least the members of the RAP.
Well, these were regulators.
Huh?
These were regulators on the panel.
No.
Were there citizens on the panel? Were there end user citizens?
There were water suppliers.
Yeah, so typically what would be occurring to this is the water loss has to be accounted for new withdrawals or new capital investments in the future. So a reduction in the water loss actually saves them some money in capital investment they would have to do for a new intake, new withdrawal that they have to do for investments. And those typically cost a significant amount of money versus the application they would use and engineers that they would need to do for a water loss methodology development.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Cudlis?
Ms. Wood, do you mind?
Mr. Seeger?
Mr. Cudlis, two quick questions. To kind of follow up on Mr. Kilgore, are there, I know in other clean water or drinking water programs, there's technical assistance to local communities to kind of defray some of the costs of doing some of the O&M side. Is there a similar program that you're aware of in the state of Virginia that would help a municipality or a commercial industrial user do some of this leak detection that you're aware of?
I'm having a hard time hearing you. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Are there, to the best you are aware of, are there technical assistance programs in the state that might provide assistance to a municipality or to a commercial or into an industrial facility to help do some of this leak detection?
We did have a presentation by the Virginia Department of Health on the municipal side. They do have a technical assistance program that they indicated could be brought to bear to assist with some of the localities. There's also, as I indicated, assistance through some of these national umbrella organizations. The gentleman that Drew, who's listed on the wrap, he's the first guy listed. He's actually under contract to AWWA to provide that type of assistance nationally, and so they fund him to do that. On the municipal and industrial side, we have some experience with that on the groundwater withdrawal permits just because of the Water Conservation and Management Plan. And I think we have a pretty good relationship and a pretty good understanding of where some of the most likely areas of challenges are. And we would continue to try to implement that same type of relationship on the agricultural and municipal and industrial side to kind of work that out with each individual based on their unique characteristics.
Okay. And as a kind of a follow-up to that, and this may be a little bit outside the scope, but just kind of curious, the point was raised about addressing leaks in a system can ultimately result in a cost savings for the municipality. Obviously, the state receives significant either federal or state funding to do infrastructure investment. Mm-hmm. Do you expect that your leak detection data will help inform the state's prioritization in terms of projects they might pursue under the drinking water program to deal with some of the leaks that are identified in this audit?
Well, certainly I think it provides a data point that's going to be very helpful to people who make those decisions that wouldn't have been there otherwise. I think also that the timing is somewhat fortuitous in that you have a fairly significant amount of new infrastructure money coming at a time when this requirement's likely to be in place. And so I think that's going to be very useful for people in implementation and in prioritization.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions for Scott? There being none, you may proceed with staff recommendation.
Okay. Next slide. Madam Chair, staff recommends that the State Water Control Board approve the proposed amendments to 9 VAC 25-210 and 9 VAC 25-610 and authorize staff to proceed to notice of public comment.
Any questions or comments regarding staff recommendation?
Madam Chair, I make a motion to accept the staff recommendations.
Motion's been made by Mr. Seeger. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Dunn. Any questions about the motion? Comments? There being none, all those in favor of the motion on the table signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
Please note that for the record. Mr. Kilgore's no. Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will move on to other business. So we will start with solar project siting study update, House Bill 206 from 2022, actions of Assembly. Mr. Dowd, nice to see you.
Nice to see you again, Madam Chairman. I'm Mike Dowd. I'm the Director of the Air and Renewable Energy Division for DEQ, and I'm pleased to be here today to present on the status of the solar project siting study required under HB 206. I'll just kill time until the handout is passed out. I believe this is my first presentation to the Water Board in my many years here at DEQ. My usual turf is the Air Board, but I'm glad to be here today. And how do we advance these? I have to ask them. Okay, next slide, please. HB 206 was enacted in the last session of the General Assembly, and it directed DEQ to form an advisory panel to look at the impact to prime agricultural soils and forest land, and to evaluate appropriate mitigation as a result of utility solar development under DEQ's Small Renewable Energy Permit by Rule program, or PBR program as we call it. HB 206 required that these regulations be developed and promulgated by DEQ no later than the end of 2024. As an interim measure, the statute directed DEQ to prepare a report to the General Assembly by December 1st of this year, advising the General Assembly on the progress DEQ and the advisory panel have been making in developing those regulations. Next slide, please. DEQ solicited an advisory panel consisting of representatives from a wide variety of groups as specified in HB 206. The advisory panel was comprised of approximately 90 participants that included environmental interests, solar developer interests, localities, representatives from multiple state agencies, and other interested parties. Representatives from state agencies and state universities were utilized as subject matter experts, attending all advisory panel meetings and providing expertise and advice when asked for. Due to the size of the advisory panel, DEQ contracted with the University of Virginia's Institute for Engagement and Negotiation to facilitate the advisory panel process. DEQ and UVA set up a series of 5 meetings, 3 in Richmond and 2 in Charlottesville, for the advisory panel to develop recommendations for the General Assembly's report. Next slide, please. Thank you. Since the advisory panel was so large, it was split into 5 work groups. 2 of the work groups were combined due to the similarity of topics. The topics the work groups addressed were basically those that HB 206 specifically directed DEQ and the advisory panel to consider. Work Group 1 worked on issues involving avoidance and mitigation. Work Group 2 and 3 looked at issues involving mitigation and in lieu mitigation. Work Group 4 worked on trying to define when projects that affected fewer than 10 acres of prime soils and less than 50 acres of forests could nevertheless be deemed to cause a significant adverse environmental impact. And Work Group 5 examined issues pertaining to local control. That is, specifically, at what point in the process should local authorities be informed of a proposed solar development, and to what extent should local, county, and municipal governments exercise control over the environmental impacts of solar projects proposed in their jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Thank you. The work groups developed 41 proposals in all. The final meeting of the advisory panel was held on September 28th, at which 11 major proposals, or those proposals considered close to consensus, were discussed. Unfortunately, no consensus was reached by the advisory panel on any major issue. Next slide, please. These are the topics that were discussed by the entire advisory panel at its final meeting. These included the definition of disturb, the definition of minimize, the definition of significant adverse impact, the development of a standardized checklist of functions and values, scoring criteria to assess environmental impacts, criteria on how to evaluate program effectiveness, and methods for field verification, among other things. One thing that was agreed to at the September 28th meeting was that the Virginia Department of Energy should complete the work it has been doing on a guidebook for solar project development. Unfortunately, that was really the biggest consensus, the major point that they did reach consensus on in the whole process. Next slide, please. Okay. These are some of the major issues that the advisory panel tackled and failed to reach consensus on. For instance, perhaps the most significant one is, how do you value the loss of environmental or ecological function? For example, how much is a tree worth? Well, that depends on who you ask, but I can tell you that folks from all across the spectrum have some very strong opinions on that question, and it is a question that has to be answered before value can be placed on mitigation measures. Another question was, should an applicant be allowed to perform mitigation measures off the project site? And should in lieu mitigation be allowed? Another question was, should prime agricultural soils be contiguous in order to trigger the 10-acre presumption of a significant environmental impact? And at what point should localities be informed of the details of a proposed solar project? Localities want to be informed as soon as possible, but applicants say that informing the localities too early in the process interferes or impedes their competitive interests. And finally, should localities be able to impose stricter mitigation or additional environmental requirements than the state agencies require? These are the questions that elicited a wide variety of opinion from the advisory panel. And they're the questions the advisory panel and DEQ are going to have to tackle head on again next year as we put pen to paper and draft the regulations as required by the statute. Next slide, please. The next steps. Well, DEQ staff, with the assistance of UVA, has prepared a draft report that has been reviewed by the administration and is now undergoing final preparation. The final report will be presented to the governor and the General Assembly later this week, no later than December 1st, which I think is Thursday. Although the final report will contain few issues on which consensus was reached, it does thoroughly present the views of all the advisory panel members, and it will provide a strong foundation for the work we have to do going forward. If the General Assembly takes no further action on this topic in the next session, DEQ will reconvene the advisory panel and begin the process of drafting the regulations required by 206 early next year, and we'll be building upon the work, the foundational work we did this year. And next slide. Any questions?
There are questions for Mr. Dow.
Yes, sir, Mr. Dunn.
Mr. Dunn.
You hear a lot of comments about farmland and forestation. Was there any discussions about economic development impact?
There was in the local work group as well, should that be taken into account. Now, specifically, that was one of the charges in HB 206, and it's one of the ones that that'll have to be tackled with how do you balance economic development against the increased regulation placed upon solar developers. Yep. But there was no consensus reached on that point, Mr. Don.
Got a question, actually.
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Cameron.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. I appreciate your spending some time with the Water Board. I point out that if farmland goes out of production, that has economic impacts as well. John Deere dealerships go under, restaurants don't get as much business. So I think there are multiple aspects of the economic impact one needs to look at. Earlier today, we had a presentation on small municipal separate stormwater control systems. And in addition to the economic impact on the smaller municipalities for complying with those requirements, I'd point out that our larger cities, whether it's Richmond or Fairfax County or City of Alexandria, are spending hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on stormwater management over time. And we also heard that forests are very effective tools for controlling nutrients and sheer volume of water associated with precipitation events. So, I'm concerned that a proliferation of solar farms that would lead to reduction of forests in particular may jeopardize a large investment that our municipalities, especially the large ones, are making on stormwater control across the Commonwealth. So was that connection at all explored in the RAP?
It was, and I think if you look at the report, when it gets posted later this week, the report itself is about 85 pages. There are about 600 pages of appendix. And in those, you will find a very thorough setting forth of all the positions, and that issue was discussed in the work groups, absolutely. And of course, the opposing viewpoint was also expressed by many in the solar industry as well. And that's what's going to make our task difficult next year.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your taking on that difficult task, and we will all eagerly observe your progress. And thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mike?
Well, it's interesting that you came to talk to us today about this, and there's also an article in Richmond Times-Dispatch about the same topic.
Oh, was there today? I haven't got a chance to look at the paper yet.
One more thought, if you'll, if you'll.
Cameron.
Thank you so much. Was there any consideration of the life cycle costs of these solar facilities, in particular the solid waste disposal implications of all these millions potentially of solar panels 10 or 20 years from now?
That topic was really not part of this work group. There was a separate statute passed by the General Assembly. There was another work group looking at that, and I forget the number of that. I think it was 894. But there was a task force or a work group under the State Corporation Commission, I believe.
Might be 897.
What?
897?
Is it 897? Yeah, but it was a separate work group. DEQ was on that work group as well. I did not participate on it, but that was under the auspices of the State Corporation Commission.
If it's consistent with your wishes, Madam Chairman, I'd love it if Mr. Dow could periodically update us on what's going on this topic, perhaps, if not at our next meeting, then the one after that.
I'd be
Glad to.
That's fine with me if it did.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. So before we move forward, I'll ask members of the board, our lunch is here, and it's 12:05. I don't know if you want to try to go through these next six or so items and then break, or if you would like to break down. Just give me, go for it? All right, let's move it, let's move ahead. I have to ask, just in case. You never want to be the person that stands between, lunch and people. Okay, the next item under other business is a stormwater guidance update from Mr. Hammond.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the State Water Control Board. I'm Drew Hammond with the Water Permitting Division here this afternoon, since we are past 12, and I'll try to make this short, to give a little update to the board on our stormwater guidance that the agencies worked this past year to prepare. Just a point of clarification, I say stormwater, what I'm really going to be talking about is construction stormwater. And for a little bit of context, you've heard Ms. Davenport talk about this program a lot in front of the State Water Control Board since 2013. But the agency serves as the local Virginia Stormwater Management Program Authority, or VSMP Authority, in 55 jurisdictions in the Commonwealth. So we, in that context, review and approve stormwater management plans, and the local governments review and approve erosion and sediment control plans. On top of that, the agency also serves as both the VSMP Authority and the Erosion and Sediment Control Program Authority, responsible for plan approval for both sets of those plans for state and federal entities. And plan approval is required for coverage underneath of the construction general permit regulation. So before we issue coverage underneath of that general permit, part of preparing your stormwater pollution prevention plan is obtaining stormwater management plan approval and erosion and sediment control plan approval. For a little bit more context, last fiscal year, the agency reviewed over 400 projects. We approved approximately 330, either stormwater plans, E&S plans, or a combination plan. And we do that with a staff of about 20 individuals. And some of that staff are primarily dedicated to plan review, but some of that same staff are also do double duty. So they do plan review as well as compliance inspections in the field. Next slide. So that got us to the development of Water Guidance Memo 22-2011, which is streamlined plan review for stormwater management and or erosion and sediment control plans. So we put together a guidance document that laid out, I like to refer to it as the four-legged stool. The plan needed to be prepared by a licensed professional engineer in accordance with the law and the regulations. The plan also needed to be prepared in accordance with Guidance Memo 22-2012, so I'll talk about that here in a minute. The plan, prior to being submitted to the agency for our review and concurrence, needed to be pre-reviewed by an individual holding a dual combined administrator certificate issued by the agency. So we have a certification program in the agency run by our Office of Training Services that predominantly trains local government staff as well as DEQ staff on program administration, plan review, and inspections. So as part of the streamlined process, the third leg of the stool was that that an individual holding one of those dual certificates for both stormwater and ENS had done a review of that plan and was also certifying to the agency that the plan was consistent with the law, the regs, and guidance memo 22/2012. And then the fourth leg of the stool was that the design professional preparing the plans actually utilized a standardized checklist that took them through all of the necessary plan components, both for stormwater and/or erosion and sediment control, and they included that checklist inside of their larger plan set. So we actually developed an AutoCAD drawing that had all of those requirements on it and asked professionals to start utilizing that standardized checklist, including that, and assisting staff in making it faster in our review of these projects. So put this out for notice in the register. 30-day public comment period ran from August 1st to August 31st this summer. We've received a handful of comments. Where we are now, we've gone through, we've reviewed those comments, we've prepared amendments, including a response to comments. Really, the noteworthy revision on this particular guidance memo is that, as I spoke to, the first leg of the stool is that it needed to be prepared by a licensed professional engineer. The revision that we've made is that the plan can now be prepared by a professional licensed under Chapter 4 or 22 of Title 50.1 of the Code of Virginia. So that could be an architect operating underneath of the authority of their license. That can be a professional engineer operating under the authority of their license. That can include a landscape architect. That could include a land surveyor with a B license, et cetera. So we've gone through and made that particular revision to the document. We've responded to the other comments that we've received. Mrs. Porterfield notified us yesterday that that revised guidance document has been submitted to the Registrar's office for publication in the Register for an additional 30-day public comment period. That'll happen from December 19th through January 18th. Which will give us a tentative effective date of January 19th of 2023. So, next slide. This one's a little bit more detailed, so there are a couple more slides here, but as I spoke to when I was talking about Guidance Memo 22/2011, the second leg of that stool is that the plan needed to be prepared in accordance with this guidance memo. This one was a little bit longer. It was 60 pages long. Basically, we looked at a handful of different stormwater and/or erosion and sediment control design manuals all across the Commonwealth and/or across the United States and said, hey, what's a format that works really well for us? We picked one, went forward with it. We worked for approximately 2.5 months to develop that 60-page guidance document, and I've referred to that as the preferred pathway. It doesn't mandate or specifically indicate one pathway that a design professional has to use, but this is the preferred pathway. So it lays out the preferred pathway for developing your stormwater and/or erosion and sediment control plan to ensure or show compliance with the state's Stormwater Management Act, Erosion and Sediment Control Law, and the associated regulations itself. When we public noticed Guidance Memo 22/2011, we also public noticed Guidance Memo 22/2012. 30-day public comment period. It was the same time frame, August 1st through August 31st. This one we received several hundred comments on. We've gone through and prepared amendments to that particular guidance memo, including a response to comments. And before I kind of talk through the next steps, I just wanted to kind of dovetail my conversation into the work that the Air and Renewable Energies Division is working through with solar. You just heard Director Dowd talk about that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this guidance memo with respect to solar panel arrays and or solar projects. So this memo does include a section 5.5, on solar panel arrays. That was developed in the context of the agency earlier this year in March and April published 2 memos that spoke to solar panels, solar panel design, solar panels to be considered unconnected impervious cover, et cetera, and then indicated that further agency guidance would provide clarification to those 2 memos. So that's what section 5.5 does. And basically what 5.5 has in it is it has a provision in there, just like the memos from earlier this year, that solar panels are to be considered unconnected impervious areas unless a quote-unquote an interconnection approval is obtained by December 31st of 2024. And I'll talk a little bit more about interconnection approval here in a minute. But the bigger thing is that if a designer is developing a solar array, solar project, and the solar panels are directly connected to the storm sewer system, which basically means that rain falls on the solar panel, runs off to impervious cover, so either gravel, asphalt, whatever else, and that runs directly to a storm sewer system, that's considered directly connected. This section does not apply to them. Next slide, please. So solar panel arrays, interconnection approval. We worked with industry representatives, et cetera, to set up a pathway to provide certainty around the term interconnection approval. That's tied to that December 31st, 2024 date. We tried to be as encompassing and as flexible as possible in the guidance memo. We've resulted in 4 different avenues for interconnection approval. The first one being the issuance of a system impact study as defined in PJM Manual 14A. For folks that are not in the solar business, PJM is the regional transmission organization responsible for grid interconnection here in the Commonwealth. So if an entity has a system impact study, on or before that December 31st date, then the requirements don't apply. If there is an equivalent study issued by PJM under the interconnection reform process that PJM is currently working through with FERC right now, then the requirements don't apply. If there's an issuance of a small generator interconnection agreement that go through the small interconnection process, then the requirements don't apply. And then the other big thing is that, or the 4th avenue that's utilized at this point right now is the submission and then acceptance of an interconnection service request application. So that is the process by which an entity would either file an application either with PJM being the regional transmission organization or an electric utility. So that's where we are with interconnection approval. That's what will be noticed on December 19th. Next slide. So how does that tie into stormwater management plans for post-construction quantity and quality management? So if you don't meet interconnection approval prior to December 31st, 2024, then your solar panel arrays need to be considered unconnected impervious areas if they are. Unconnected impervious areas, just to put that in context, is, as you can see on the picture there, water falls on that solar panel. It's at some type of operating angle. That water then hits the pervious surface underneath of it. So whether that be managed turf, whether that be open space, any other combination of a pervious surface, and then that water subsequently runs across that area sheet flow before it enters the stormwater conveyance system itself. So that is unconnected impervious area and how that applies to the panels themselves. The other clarifying point on this slide is that it only applies to the horizontal projected area of the panels itself. So, and I call that HPA. There's a big, long engineering equation that looks there that kind of has that laid out. Really what that boils down to, it's the length of the panel array times the width of the panel array multiplied by what I call theta, which is that little circle with a line through it. But really that just means the operating angle. So if the panel's operating basically flat during the day and it rains, then the effective area or the horizontal projected area on the ground surface is the length and the width of the panel. If the panel so happens to be, or if an entity can implement rain sensing technology, which they've indicated to us that folks can do that, the operating angle will actually be 0. They can rotate that panel to almost nearly 90 degrees and basically have it so the rain isn't falling on that impervious cover and is actually hitting the pervious cover underneath of it itself. So we've provided that flexibility in section 5.5 also. And there have been some entities that have indicated that that is definitely a potential, that they're looking at that because they already rotate panels for protection from high winds and protection from hail and sleet. Next slide, please. A little bit more about unconnected impervious cover. There are a lot of folks in the design industry that were really concerned about this change. So we did include in section 5.5 the ability to adjust their post-development runoff curve number to account for that disconnection from the stormwater conveyance system. That concept has been around since 1986. So it's not something new. It's not something that the design community wasn't aware of. The manuals that we refer to and use every day to develop and design these things, like I said, the Soil Conservation Service Technical Release 55, June 1986, has the concept of unconnected impervious area and a runoff adjustment associated with it in that design manual itself. But what we did is not only can they use that NRCS method out of Technical Release 55 to do that, there's also an alternate method in the National Engineering Handbook, which is an update of TR 55. They can utilize that method. Or in Virginia, we have this method called the Virginia Runoff Reduction Method. And that includes a provision in it for adjusting your curve number to take into account solar panel disconnection from the storm sewer system. The second thing that we had a lot of interest in and a lot of comment on was site compaction that occurs to construct these. That's been widely varying depending upon the entity that actually does the work and how they do it and how these things are sited. Some of them do a lot of earth moving activities to prepare these sites. Some of them do very minimal site compaction and earthwork to prepare these sites for solar panels. So we included a number of provisions for runoff curve number adjustment to take into account site compaction, cutting, and filling during construction. We gave them multiple pathways to do that curve number adjustment. We had a fairly simple one that's in section 5.3(2)E that applies to all land disturbing activities but can also be applied in this particular case. But like I said earlier, there is a provision for adjusting your curve number in TR 55 from 1986 or the National Engineering Handbook, Chapter 7 that's published out online by NRCS now. And then we also added an alternative, so in lieu of doing that curve number adjustment for site compaction, they can implement decompaction strategies following our stormwater specification number 4 that we have here at DEQ. That's part of the Stormwater BMP Clearinghouse, or they can work with the agency to develop a DEQ approved decompaction plan. Next slide, please. So just kind of to walk you through the next steps, along with 22-2011, Ms. Porterfield also submitted the revised 22-2012 to the Registrar's Office yesterday. So we are set to publish that on December 19th, and that comment period will run through December 19th through January 18th of 2023 with a tentative effective date of January 19th of next year. Next slide. And with that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions from the board.
Madam Chairman?
Mr. Cameron.
Thank you. So how did you come up with the effective date of January of 2024, I think it was, or December of 2024?
That part, or that date, December 31st, 2024, that was when we were developing the series of memos in March of April of this year. That was a negotiation between the agency, the nonprofit NGO community, as well as the industry representatives from the solar groups.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Yes, I think you had a clarification?
Just in addition, if I may.
Ms. Davenport.
It's also tied to the date that's in the work that's being done under HB 206 in terms of when those projects need to meet those mitigation and avoidance requirements. So it's all kind of part and parcel of the same.
Okay, thank you.
date.
I appreciate that. It's been a long time since I took trigonometry in high school, and this is the first time in my entire life I've actually ever seen a cosine used for anything in the real world. So, thank you for helping me realize I didn't completely waste those 4 months as a senior in high school.
Well, you go back to that picture and you quickly realize that, the cosine of 0 is 1, right? And the cosine of 90 is 0.
I've actually forgotten that.
It made it pretty easy.
Yeah.
We went to law school.
It's an SAT question.
We should make him be a surveyor for a few months.
The other point I wanted to make, and it touches on some of the previous discussion, I think one needs to at least be mindful of the stormwater controls foregone by taking out a tree and putting in grass underneath a solar array. I was with the Potomac River Keepers on the South Fork of the Shenandoah a couple of months ago in a kayak, and someone in the group told us that one mature sycamore can take about 250 gallons of water a day out of the river in that case. And I suspect that the surface area foregone by converting from a tree to grass doesn't have that same absorption capacity for stormwater.
That's a good point. The agency is, we have undertaken a separate stormwater action that you've heard the director talk about. Part of that action, which is a new stormwater manual, a consolidated stormwater manual. One of the things that the agency will be looking at with that stakeholders group is trees as a best management practice. We've developed a draft specification for trees as a best management practice, actually following the Chesapeake Bay Program's expert panel report on that. And that was a result of a report that the agency developed a stakeholders group and actually had a lot of conversation around last year. So we did that in preparation for 2022, and we did that late 2021 and developed a report for the General Assembly that we turned in December of 2021.
Any other questions for Drew? Thank you, Drew.
Thank you.
Could I just say one thing, Madam?
Oh.
I just want to express my appreciation for Drew and his whole team, because he spent too much time with me this year talking about this topic, and it's an amazing, amazing amount of work it's taken for his whole task force basically to pull this together, and it's going to make a big difference in Virginia. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rolban. Thanks, Drew. Let's see, next on the agenda, FY 2023 Virginia Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund, final authorizations. Karen, nice to see you.
All right, Madam Chair, members of the board, my name is Karen Duran. I'm the program manager for DEQ's Clean Water Financing and Assistance Program. Under tab G, I present to you the proposed Virginia Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund project priority list for fiscal year 2023 for your approval. The funding list will become an integral part of our intended use plan that is required with our application for the annual federal capitalization grant from EPA. Next slide. On June 6, staff solicited applications for the FY23 funding cycle, with July 29th established as the deadline for submittal. Based on this solicitation, DEQ received applications for 69 wastewater improvement projects, including 15 Southwest Virginia pilot program construction projects, plus 2 stormwater projects and 2 land conservation projects, with the amount requested totaling $495,955,977. Staff reviewed an updated capacity assessment of the fund to determine the level of authorizations the fund could manage while maintaining the ability to provide funds for requests in future years. Based on this assessment, staff determined that all projects could not be funded this year and proceeded to eliminate 9 projects from the funding list based on project eligibility, compliance with Virginia code, and previously established project bypass procedures. Additionally, 1 request was reduced from $100 million to $50 million. By memorandum dated September 14th, 2022, the Director of DEQ authorized staff to proceed to public comment for 64 projects totaling $307,577,537. A 30-day public comment period was held September 19th to October 21st, and a public meeting was convened on October 21st. Notice of the meeting was posted on the Virginia Regulatory Town Hall and DEQ's Clean Water Financing and Assistance Program website. No comments were received. Next slide. Like the last several years, we are proposing that the program rate subsidy for wastewater-related projects differ depending on the term of the loan. The hardship rate be set at 0.5%. The rate for the Southwest Virginia pilot program construction projects be set at 0%. And a minimum interest rate of 1% be applied to all other loans. A description of the subsidy breakdown is included on page 2 of the memo in your board book. Next slide. With substantial revenues coming in from our large loan portfolio and continued federal and state match funding, the revolving loan fund continues to maintain healthy account balances. The fund will have sufficient funding available from cash balances and leveraged bond proceeds during the FY23 funding cycle to cover the 64 projects on the proposed project list, which is shown on this slide and the next 2. So next slide. And next slide. The staff recommends that the board should authorize funding for all of the applications on the final project list. I can now take any of your questions or move to staff recommendation.
Any questions for Karen? Ryan?
Can I just ask one quick
Seaver.
question? The general header of this is projects funded out of the state's revolving loan fund. Is this both annual appropriations as well as the Investment and Jobs Act funding, or is it just one or the other?
So these funds are provided from grants from EPA, so this is not General Assembly funding. So it's EPA grants, state match, plus revolved loan funds that we've gotten over the years.
Sorry, maybe more specifically, my question is obviously under general appropriations for the revolving loan fund, it's kind of a standard, but under the Investment and Jobs Act, there was a kind of legal requirement that half the money go out as loans or traditional loans and half the money go out as grants and grant subsidies. I'm just kind of curious, does your intended use plan in terms of the subsidizations include that requirement that was kind of additional for the Investment and Jobs Act, or does it not include that?
It will include that, yes.
It will include that.
Yes.
So acceptance of this list will be compliant both with the traditional SRF as well as the additional requirements of the Jobs Act.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? We proceed with staff recommendation.
All right. The staff recommends that the board authorize the execution of loan agreements, loan amounts, interest rates, and terms for the projects listed on the table on the last 2 pages of the memo in your board book for $307,577,537 in loan assistance.
Madam Chair, I'd like to offer a motion that we accept the 64 projects since more than half of those come from deep southwest Virginia.
Motion's been made by Ms. Wallace and seconded by Mr. Kilgore from Southwest Virginia. And your colleague from the other side of the state, Norfolk, we have the other ones on the list. So I will intend to announce I will be in favor of the motion. So motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. By the way, this is my favorite thing we do every year. So I just think it's something good. So appreciate it. Thank you. Division Director's Report. Mr. Morris.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
There's one
Ms.
item
Brookfield.
on the agenda before that, the controversial permits. There are none.
Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped over it. I didn't mean to.
Skipped over me, but
It's
I
probably
just-
because you told me that earlier.
True, that is true. So there are no controversial permits to report to the board.
Thank you.
Just for the record. Thank you.
Madam Chair and members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. My name is Scott Morris. I'm the new Water Division Director, and I'm going to be speaking towards the organizational changes that have occurred since the last board meeting that we wanted to make you aware of. Next slide, please. I just wanted to break down to you what the Division of Water now encompasses. So we did go through and combine the Division of Water Planning and the Division of Water Permitting. Melanie Davenport was the previous Director of Water Permitting, and then after I give you this update, I'm going to ask her to come up here and give you an update on her new role, so you're aware of that as well. But we've also pulled in Office of Clean Water Financing and assistance, what you just like to see with the grant programs. So that's now all under one division within water. We've also segmented off a little bit of the Division of Water Planning that was previously groundwater and surface water permitting, and that's now going to be under the Division of Water Permitting. But this update is just to give you an awareness of those different segmentations off, and then also the conglomeration of everything into the single water division. And by all means, I'm a single point of contact from going forward, so if you have any questions, reach out to me and I'll get you that answer. Melanie, would you step up?
Did you provide your contact information?
They got it.
Thank you, Scott. Welcome.
Well, Madam Chairman, members of the board, as Scott said, we do have some organizational changes. I took a new role at DEQ back in October. I'm reporting directly to Mike Rolban. The office title is Regulatory Affairs and Outreach. It's one of those weird government titles that doesn't really tell you what to do, what I do, but it is multimedia in nature. It has a number of divisions and programs under it, including enforcement, environmental enhancement, which is coastal zone management, NEPA pollution prevention. Environmental justice is now one of my programs. I am also standing up a small team to help with permitting assistance. They're called ombudsmen, although I'm debating whether they should be called ombudspersons. And then also reg affairs, to the extent that it's kind of a multimedia approach to our regulatory actions, to reg reform and that kind of stuff. So you'll still see me. I'll probably be coming to all of the board meetings because all of your actions, for the most part, are regulatory in nature, but I wanted to thank you. I've been talking and working with you guys for 11 years. We've gotten a lot done. We've been through some interesting items and agendas. So just wanted to say thanks, and I will continue working with you in my new capacity.
Thank you. That sounds like a really exciting new role. So glad to know that you'll still be with us. And Scott, welcome.
Yep, thank you. And with that, any questions you got for me, I'd be happy to answer. Otherwise, we can get you quickly on to your next agenda item.
Any questions for Scott or Melanie? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda under other business, Virginia's response. Oh boy, you guys are going to make me say a word that I don't say every day. Virginia's response to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. I barely passed chemistry, but I passed.
Well, good afternoon. I think it's afternoon now, right? Yeah. Madam Chair, members of the board, my name's Jeff Steers. I'm Director of Regional Operations at DEQ and somehow the point person on perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. And so I came before you about a year ago, last December, and gave a quick update. And I just wanted to do a little more just to keep you as this topic is becoming more and more in the news, and we're hearing more, and we're doing more in state government, not just the DEQ. I wanted to give you a quick briefing on where we're at these days, and some of this might be repetitive, but I'll try to go quickly through it. Next slide. So as you know, I mean, we see these compounds in a lot of different consumer products. I'll say one of the biggest things that we see it from is AFFF, it's called, but it's firefighting foam, where again, these compounds, there's thousands of them that have been around for a long time. They're very persistent in the environment, and their properties that help our everyday lives are actually what makes them difficult to get out of the environment, because they're doing what they were designed to do many years ago. So next slide. And this just to remind you that not only the firefighting foams, but a lot of different manufacturing operations in different sectors of industry have historically used this or may still be using these compounds. There's a lot less of it in use, for example, maybe in the textile and leather industry than there was before, but similar to PCBs that we've all been talking about for decades, these things have a historic background, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. So a lot of it's old contamination, for example, that we're dealing with. Next slide. And again, just a reminder, we can get them from every pathway, every media, air, water, waste, and with these chemicals and compounds, we tend to transfer them between environmental media. So you may have a treatment system with activated granulated activated carbon that's being regenerated. You may get materials out of that that end up going to an incinerator. Depending on the incinerator type, it may not completely remove those. It gets back into the air pathway, back down, and so on. And so we've got landfill leachates, we've got agricultural from wastewater and biosolids from various sources. So it's a continuous span, and the cycle is ongoing. Next slide. So again, we refer to these as forever chemicals. Most of the emphasis that's going on at a national level and in Virginia has to do with drinking water. And EPA's recently came up with some revised lifetime health advisory numbers for a few of these compounds, which will be the basis for a maximum contaminant level in drinking water that they propose to issue at the end of the year. So sometime next month, they will propose an MCL for several of these PFAS compounds, because today there are none. Some states have come up with numbers. VDH, who's got primacy for drinking water in Virginia, studied it under a House bill in 2020 that required them to look at developing standards. They did sampling, paid for some sampling of source water and finished water, found it, as you can imagine, in different locations, not necessarily super high around the state, but still it was there. And there was not consensus amongst the water purveyors, the localities, and others that we develop a standard outside of EPA because you're putting in a large investment into some treatment that may not be the right treatment for whatever EPA comes up with, and they are supposed to come up with a standard soon. So the bottom line is they're studying it some more at VDH. Virginia DEQ, and our role is primarily to look for sources of it, try to understand the historic uses of it, and how to get it reduced in the environment. Next slide. So what we've done is, and I'm just going to touch on a few things that are of significance. One of them is looking at wastewater discharges for any current or past use of these compounds. And so we did an industrial user survey, did not get good results in the response that we had hoped for. So we're still having to do follow-up with that. But we do find that there are, based on some of the limited data we've been able to review so far, there are folks out there that have used or are using it. Some of them have tested these compounds. Some of them may have released some into their municipal sewage treatment plant or POTW without the authority knowing that it's even coming into their plant. So we're trying to kind of connect the puzzles together so that where we have indirect users, because that's where a lot of our sources are. There's our VIPDs, permitted industrial users, then there's the indirect users under a pretreatment program. We're trying to connect with the utilities and with the industrial users to make sure that they're talking and that they understand how PFAS may be in their systems. And in doing that, we're trying to identify what might be higher potential sources of ongoing releases based on that survey and some ambient water monitoring that we've recently had funded by the General Assembly. And so we've been doing some rounds of monitoring across the state in different locations, looking at areas that maybe are near some of these large facilities that may have the right SIC code from the past use of this. Some of it's just random. Some of them are areas where the VDH's water testing that I brought up had some hits in some known areas. And so we're trying to put all those pieces together to say where are the potential areas of concern with PFAS across the Commonwealth where we would benefit from getting more data, because there isn't a lot out there in Virginia. We don't have water quality standards, and we have a lot. If you compare us with other states such as Michigan, Minnesota, Colorado, Maine, they've done a lot already, but they had a lot of funding. And so we're trying to go through a process of kind of peeling the onion back, looking for it in certain areas. One of the next things that we hope to do early 2023 is develop a process working with BMA and VAMWA to come up with self-monitoring requirements by certain types of businesses and industry. And we have the authority to require PFAS monitoring as part of an industrial discharge under the Clean Water Act and under Virginia's state water pollution control laws. So it's a matter of kind of working with these organizations and with our staff to try to understand what's the best way, because the testing is very expensive. There's a high demand for it, so getting turnaround times is difficult. So we're going to continue to do that. Meanwhile, we're looking at other things such as landfill leachate, especially in areas where it's not collected from old unlined landfills, because landfill leachate is a source that's been documented in other states to have PFAS compounds, so there may be some impacts to groundwater and surface water. We're looking at air sources is still a little challenging because they haven't yet really landed on a good method for sampling for air sources. And a lot of this, just even the effluent monitoring that we're considering now, that was only recently got to the point where they're going to, EPA's come up with a standard or appropriate test method. Next slide. I'm going to kind of go through quickly. So biosolids has been something we've been hearing a lot of concerns with when we get from the public. And I will say it's not just biosolids, but VIPDs permit renewals, pretreatment program reviews that are subject to public comment. They all are asking for, a lot of these, they're asking for PFAS monitoring. And so we're trying to develop a strategy that includes for biosolids and looking at an assessment, but not getting out ahead of EPA, who really has the expertise in a lot of what they're doing on a national level. So, you know, they're settling on a method for doing biosolids monitoring There's a lot of work being done. The Virginia Biosolids Council's been active in some of this research, and we hope to get some better information and start working towards looking again at areas where we've got the potential for sources that might be significant to do additional monitoring and see what that is. It's like effluent monitoring from a VIPD's permit discharge. We don't have standards to judge it against necessarily, but we also do want to know if we've got some significant source that's upstream of a public water intake, for example, or if it's impacting fish. We're doing fish tissue analysis in a couple areas where we've got some significant investigations going on. Next slide. I need to make this quick. Just want to let you know that the bulk of our active ongoing investigations have been with federal facilities, as you can imagine, DOD installations, where they've used firefighting phones pretty extensively for training and in response. This kind of, next slide, that, it's pretty much the eastern crescent of Virginia where we've got a lot of these investigations going on. Some of them have impacted off-site groundwater in a public water supply, for example, Nassau Wallops Island, where it impacted a municipal well field. So the Defense Department and a lot of our responsible parties going forward, because it's not yet classified as a hazardous substance under the Superfund cleanup standards, you can't necessarily require a cleanup standard to be set and cleaned up to until they do that. And there's a lot of legal debate about who's got liability in the future if you start calling this a hazardous substance like other ones. And that goes all the way from biosolids to landfill leachates that get transferred into a municipal sewage treatment plant. It goes on and on. But EPA is proposing to, and they had taken recently public comment on calling these chemicals, a certain class of these chemicals, as a hazardous substance. Next slide. So 2 things real quick. One of them is the Middle Chickahominy watershed, where we discovered through sampling that the Newport News Water Works was doing based on information they had along the Chickahominy, where they have a reservoir, is we found pretty significant levels of some of these compounds that could be tied to firefighting foams. Next slide. It was found in the White Oak Swamp in hundreds of times greater, thousands of times greater than EPA's health advisory numbers. And so we've been working with the Department of Health, the Water Authority, Henrico County, and we've come up with, we've done a lot of sampling of private wells, surface water, fish tissue, and we're working to continue to identify. We think we have several sources that include the airport area with some form of military and active military bases that are contributing to this. And so we're working through a process on how do we minimize those impacts and continue to monitor to make sure that we're being protective of human health, especially certain fish that might be eaten or consumed in the Middle Chickahominy. So we've been working with VDH on a standard to come up with for fish advisories for PFAS. Next slide. Next slide. It went blank. Well, I will go from memory. Oh, there it is. So with this and another study I'll just briefly mention, we're coming up with story map pages that will allow the public to see what we're doing on certain investigations that may impact the public or that there's interest in, where we tell the story, show pictures, show data. Next slide. This includes a data dashboard where you can click on any sampling that's been done and be able to look at it and compare to what the numbers are that we're judging these samples against. And going forward, we're going to try to do this with more of our ambient monitoring. It's a resource issue, but it seems to be a good tool for helping the public understand PFAS a little better.
Jeff, Jeff, is your mic on?
Yes, I'm just not down close enough.
There we go. Thank you.
And the last one I just wanted to mention was an investigation that was found during VDH's sampling in the Roanoke River with the Western Virginia Water Authority, where they found some pretty high levels of Gen X, which is a newer version of it's a process that creates a newer version of certain PFAS compounds. And they found it in the finished water, the reservoir, the Roanoke River, And so we did a lot of investigation and sampling of the river, found the source in a small town upstream, found an industrial user that was discharging these chemicals into that small wastewater treatment plant. We've since had them stop discharging, and they've minimized significantly the levels. They have dropped. But again, these chemicals are persistent in the environment, so there are impacts to the Roanoke River that we're going to continue to monitor and make sure that we can look at the trends and the future can be.
By the Fourth Circuit Court. In terms of construction, there's no forward progress at this time, and construction activities are limited to inspection and maintenance of the controls and stabilization measures. As of September 2022, MVP installed anchors on new wooden supports at locations on Brush and Sinking Creek Mountains, where the existing supports had become degraded and unstable, and all of those materials were transported by air or on foot, and all work was done by hand at that site, those sites. In terms of compliance activities, DEQ and our third-party consultants are continuing daily inspections of the project, and since the last board meeting, the department has received one complaint of erosion and sediment controls needing maintenance. When investigated, the inspectors found no corrective action was required in response to that complaint, and there was no non-compliance noted at that time. And that's all I have for you, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Any questions for Mr. Stafford? Thank you.
Thank you.
Let the record show that Mr. Rolban left the room during that briefing, and it can be invited back in now, please. I think I forgot to invite him the last time, so we like, you know. So the next item on the agenda is our future meeting date. It's noted as March 23rd, 2023.
That is correct. Currently, we are scheduled to be at the same location on that same date. So that's your next future meeting date.
Please update your calendars accordingly. And then public forum. Melissa, do we have anyone for public forum?
Yes, we actually do have someone with for the public forum today. Apologies, the AV is not going to show up for the public that's listening. The speaker's name is Jessica Sims, and she has signed up to speak on the topic of gold mining and the Virginia Reliability Project. And she has 3 minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate the chance to speak with you all today. I have a handout for each of you. Is that okay to distribute?
Can we see it, please?
So just wanted to provide an update since the last quarterly meeting. Again, Jessica with Appalachian Voices. This is specific to the threat of large-scale gold mining in Virginia. We talked about last time that a study was underway, and this is something mandated by law that split into 2 studies from the National Academy of Sciences and a state agency committee. DEQ is participating on the state agency committee. So I wanted to flag for you that the report from NAS is out, and what you have in front of you are the highlights of the report that simply put strongly advise against that type of industry and flag the types of threats that would be brought. Specifically, it concludes the regulatory framework of Virginia is designed for operations like sand and gravel, not gold mining, and that the current regulatory framework is not adequate to address the potential impacts of commercial gold mining. So the specific concerns they have, there's a much longer report you can see online from the NES website, but acid rock drainage, the remobilization of legacy contamination. We know the pyrite gold belt goes from Fairfax to Halifax, and there's hundreds of abandoned gold mines that are currently leaking mercury. And so this sort of accumulation of contamination is of other concern. The waste materials, and specifically cyanide, that would be used for large-scale gold mining, which we don't have regulations for, we've never seen before. So the prospect of a catastrophic event is something I think y'all would be very concerned with, because it would all be about water, the dewatering for the processes of the industry, the potential impacts to groundwater. There's already impacts to private wells in Buckingham County from the exploratory drilling. And so looking at that report, it shows truly that Virginia is unsuitable for that scale of the industry. Wanted to flag too, the state agency committee, which does have DEQ participation on it, has completed their report, and that is supposed to be available to y'all, to the public, to members of the General Assembly on December 1st. So presuming that timeline is met, that would be additional context about potential threats to the 2.7 million folks that use the James River as their source of drinking water. So just wanted to flag that process because it has reached the end of its review. Y'all had an agenda item for controversial permits, so there is not a permit in front of you, but I want to flag something that will be of great public interest. The Virginia Reliability Project of White. It's running through areas that have had decades of recurrent flooding, have existing very distressing sewage problems. It's also being routed, so this is a 12-inch pipe that would be increased to 24 for a purported need by Columbia Gas and TC Energy. It would go through the Western Branch Reservoir, a drinking source for Norfolk. It would go through the Nansemond River. It would also go through the Great Dismal Swamp. So just want to flag a project that would certainly impact the water bodies in that region, and there's great community concern about impacts to historic and cultural assets in the area, specifically the historic oysterman community of Suffolk. So just wanted to put that on y'all's radar also. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Any other business from the board, from members of the board? Any statements? We will adjourn the November 29th meeting of the State Water Control Board. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I think this is the first time in a long time we've had everybody here. And so it's nice to see everyone in person. And I want to wish, since we're in the holiday season, wish everybody a fantastic and safe, holiday season, and hope everyone has some downtime and is able to rest and enjoy their families. So thank you.
I do. It's R. Phillips.
I think you beat me.
Obviously, I want to give you some time to settle in.
Yeah, we got some stuff to work on.
It's pretty close. And there is lunch for everyone.
Just generally, for a long time, the Water Division was the one that had the vast majority of the work over there. I'm working on a couple projects. I'm the lead agency lead on the PCB toxic torts. I think Mike has an interest in me kind of, keeping an eye on all these bits and parts of litigation, not just enforcement, but everything where we're defensive. And, just some observations on how well we've always worked with the AG's office and how and why. We have a bunch of lawyers. I'm one, and in the absence of any staff over there, I sent more than one email that said, I am a